and welcome back to Neo-Psychology with me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I teach online psychology lessons for my wonderful students. Today we're carrying on with the social influence unit and we're looking at lesson 5, obedience, situational variables. Let's crack on. Starter. Can you think of any variables that could have increased or decreased the likelihood of obedience in Milgram's research? These are some of these variables or situational variables. We're going to have a look at how they affect obedience in Milgram's obedience research today. So, after Stanley Milgram conducted his baseline study on obedience, discussed last lesson, have a look at last lesson if you need to check that out, he carried out a large number of variations in order to consider the situational variables that might lead to more or less obedience. What are some of those variables that might affect obedience levels? Those three variables are proximity, location, and uniform. So, what are situational variables? Features of the immediate physical and social environment which may influence a person's behavior, such as proximity, location, and uniform. The alternative is dispositional variables, where behavior is explained in terms of personality. Okay? So, let's explore the effects of obedience on the situational variable of, first of all, proximity. Let's have a look. The closeness of teacher and learner. That's what proximity means. Proximity means sort of like distance, right? So let's see. How does the closeness of teacher and learner affect obedience? In the baseline study, the teacher could hear the learner but not see him. In the proximity variation, teacher and learner were in the same room. Okay? And the obedience rate dropped from what to what? So, if you remember from last lesson, 65% of participants went all the way to the maximum voltage on 450. How do you think having the learner in the same room rather than a different room and being able to see them get electric shocks affect obedience? Do you think obedience went up or went down? If you can see someone getting electric shocks, it's likely to go down. It went from 65 to 40%. So obedience went down to only 40% when the teacher could see the learner physically get those electric shocks. Don't do that again. Right. In the touch proximity variation, the teacher forced the learner's hand onto a shock plate. So instead of pressing a button, like in the baseline study, the teacher had to put the learner's hand onto the electric shock plate instead. I'm assuming less people would do that. What do you think the obedience rate was for that one? It was 30%. So only 30% of people went all the way to the 450 volts. In the remote instruction variation, the experimenter left the room and gave instructions by telephone rather than be stood over them, which like it was in the baseline study. The obedience rate was 20.5%, and participants often pretended to give shocks. So it shows that having the variable of the experimenter in the lab coat stood next to them was quite a big factor, because it went from 65% that did 450 volts to only 20.5%. So that is a big factor that affects whether someone obeys or not. It was concluded that decreased proximity allows people to psychologically distance themselves from the consequences of their actions. For example, when the teacher and learner were physically separate, the teacher was less aware of the harm done, so was more obedient. And that is proximity, the situational variable of proximity. Identify one thing you learned about proximity. Why do you think learning about this is important? What was the hardest part to understand about this? And what questions has this raised for you? Feel free to put any questions in the comments. I'm sure other viewers can answer them. And that is the first variable done. The next variable we're going to look at is location, prestige of setting. How prestigious was the setting? Did this affect obedience? The study or the baseline study, the original baseline study, was conducted in Yale University, a very prestigious university. However, if the study was conducted in a rundown building rather than the prestigious Yale University, obedience rates dropped from 65% to, what do you reckon? Have a little guess. 47.5%. So the prestige of the university and the setting, obviously, or the location, obviously played a role in whether someone was likely to obey the authority figure or not. If it was in a rundown building, only 47.5% of people went up to the highest voltage of 450. It was concluded that obedience was higher in the university setting because the setting was legitimate and had authority. Obedience was expected, okay? You go to a prestigious university, you expect people that work there to know likely better than you, so therefore you're more likely to obey. Here's a quick application question. Obedience in the supermarket, AO2. One day, in the sixth form canteen, a teacher asked you to pick up a piece of litter and put it in the bin. The student duly obliged. A few days later, outside a local supermarket, another teacher asked the same student to pick up some litter and bin it. This time, the student refused. Using your knowledge of Milgram's research into situational variables, explain the difference in the student's behaviour. Pause the video, write your answer. You've got 4.5 minutes left. Off you go. I'm not going to sit here for 4.5 minutes. Let's have a look at the answer, right? Pause the video, do it, all right? Actually do it, right? Let's have a look at the answer. The student obeyed the teacher's instructions in the sixth form canteen because the teacher has authority within the school location. Everyone accepts that the teacher is entitled to expect the students to obey, but the teacher doesn't have the same authority outside a supermarket. It is also the case that obedience levels fall in a less prestigious environment, so in the supermarket, the authority figure has less effect. That's how you would explain that. And that's the variable of location. Identify one thing you learned about the situational variable of location. Why do you think learning about that is important? How can it apply in real life? What was the hardest part to understand about that? And what questions has this raised for you? Location. Done. I'm ticking it off. We're moving on to the final situational variable, which is uniform. Uniform. Why uniform? It communicates authority. In the baseline study, the experimenter wore a grey lab coat, a kind of uniform, okay? It wasn't a white lab coat because they didn't want the participants to think it was like a medical sort of authority, but a lab coat nonetheless shows authority. In one variation, he was called away by an inconvenient phone call at the start of the procedure. His role, the experimenter, was taken over by an ordinary member of the public in everyday clothes. Obedience fell from 65% to what? What do you reckon? 20%. Obedience fell to 20% when they had some random guy off the street in ordinary clothes read the instructions rather than having an experimenter there in a lab coat. The lowest of all these variations. Obedience fell to 20%. Only 20% of people shocked the participants up to the highest amount of 450 volts, whereas in the baseline study it was 65%. It was concluded that a uniform is a strong symbol of legitimate authority granted by society. Someone without a uniform has less right to expect obedience. So, if you want obedience, wear a uniform. Can you recall the levels, the obedience levels from Milgram's baseline study and research into situational variables? So, here's a graph. It's a bar chart. Graph showing obedience level in Milgram's variation of his baseline study. On the y-axis, we've got percentage of fully obedient participants, i.e. those that went up to 450 volts. In the baseline study at Yale University, the obedience level was what percent? Say out loud. 65%. Well done. Location variation, change of location to a rundown office. 47.5%. Proximity variation where the teacher and learner were in the same room. What percent? Say it out loud. 40%. touch proximity variation, where the teacher forces the learner's hand onto a plate. What was that? Can you recall it? Look down at your notes. You haven't made notes. The hell are you doing then? 30%. Remote instruction variation, where the experimenter gave orders by phone. 20%. And uniform variation, where the experimenter was played by a member of the public with no uniform. Only 20%. Now you can see how these situational variables has affected the obedience levels. Here's another application question: the power of uniform. A psychologist conducted an investigation into obedience. He used two Confederates. One was dressed as a firefighter and the other was dressed in everyday casual clothes. The Confederates stood on different streets and instructed people to pick up a piece of litter and put it into the bin. A record is kept of how many people obeyed the instructions. What is the likely outcome of this study? What do you think? Based on what you've learned about the situational variables and Milgram's research into obedience, what do you think will be found? Write your answer down, please, and I'm going to go through the answer now. The likely outcome is that more people will obey the instruction to pick up litter when it comes from the Confederate dressed as a firefighter. This is because a uniform is a symbol of a person's authority, like the experimenter's lab coat in Milgram's study. Furthermore, casual clothes do not communicate the same degree of authority, so most people would probably not obey. Okay. Watch this video of people obeying a man in a uniform. Why would they comply? Right, so it's a little show, it's a little video on YouTube, obedience, obeying a man in authority. We've got a man dressed in a policeman's outfit. Are people more likely to obey his instructions compared to if he was just wearing casual everyday clothes? We know from research, yes. Have a look, check the video out on YouTube to see the results. Uniform, that's the situational variable of uniform. Can you identify one thing you've learned about uniform? Why do you think learning about this is important? How does this apply in real life? What was the hardest part to understand about uniform? And do you have any questions? And that's the third variable done. We are now going to have a look at discussing and evaluating the situational variables affecting obedience. What are some of the strengths and limitations of situational variables affecting obedience? Let's have a look. There is strong supporting evidence. That is a strength. Bickman's Confederates dressed in different outfits, jacket and tie, milkman, security guard, and issued demands like pick up litter to people on the streets of New York City. People are twice as likely to obey the security guard than the jacket and tie Confederate. This shows that a situational variable such as a uniform does have a powerful effect on obedience. That's supporting evidence. Bickman. However, low internal validity in the studies. Orn and Holland suggested the variations compared to the baseline study were even more likely to trigger suspicion because of the extra experimental manipulation. In the variation where the experiment was replaced by a member of the public, even Milgram recognized himself that this was so contrived or artificial that some participants may have worked it out. Therefore, it is unclear whether the results are due to obedience or because the participants saw the deception and play acted, i.e. were influenced by demand characteristics. So this is a limitation. The final evaluative point I'm going to give you is the danger of situational perspective. Milgram's conclusion suggests situational factors determine obedience. Mandel argues this offers an excuse or an alibi for genocide. Situational expectations hugely oversimplify the causes of the Holocaust and are offensive to survivors. This permits others to excuse destructive behavior in terms of I was just obeying orders. It doesn't do them justice. So this is a limitation. Right, summarize each evaluative point into your own words. If you want to challenge yourself, do it into exactly 10 words. And that was today's lesson. That was lesson 5, obedience, situational variables. Next lesson is lesson 6, the agentic state and legitimacy of authority. Well done, my neo-psychologists. Great job today. Keep up the good work. God bless. and peace.
I'm feeling like Will, I feel like a prince, I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills, cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels, I wanted to flex, they told me to chill. I'm making a flip, my life is a flick, now load up the film.